Well, thanks everyone for attending. This is our second roundtable in this series being co-hosted by Sciences Center for International and Comparative Studies and the Hobby School's Center for Comparative Politics. So today what we're going to do is take on the very small and uncontroversial question of how will a President Biden versus a President Trump affect domestic policy issues. And in particular, we have 5 people here today: Ryan Kennedy, Johanna Luttrell, Pablo Pinto, Beth Simas, and Dean Watson. And we're going to go through first and review some of the main issues that each wants to discuss. So Professor Kennedy will talk about climate and energy policy. Johanna will talk about racial justice, in particular the Black Lives Matter movement. Pablo will talk about economic and trade policy. Beth will go over court appointments, in particular their implications for Obamacare and abortion policy, as well as Senate races. And then we'll have Dean Watson go through the Texas legislature and redistricting. So after we have a few minutes of covering sort of some background policy points about these issues, as well as drawing out the implications for whether one candidate or the other is successful, then I'll open it up for some question and answer from the other attendees. Okay, and with that, I decided just to let alphabetical order rule the day. So Ryan Kennedy, if you'd like to kick us off.
Sure, I have to say this is one of those rare times where I'm the first in alphabetical order. That doesn't happen very often. So I'm going to be talking about energy policy and climate change. And it seems like there's been an increase in the importance of this issue in the minds of the American public, in part because August 2020 was the hottest August in weather. 5 of the top 10 hottest Augusts have happened since 2015. Like the last 5 Augusts have been the hottest, have been among the top 10 hottest Augusts we've experienced. We now have what's likely to become a named storm in the Atlantic in late October. We have wildfires in California, Oregon, Washington, and Colorado. I mean, what we're now beginning to see is, at least it seems like, the climate change is having an impact now. It's no longer an issue where we're talking about impacts 10, 15, 20 years into the future. And so because of this, some of the latest public opinion polls suggest that about 42% of Americans believe that climate change is very important in shaping their vote, and another 26% say that it's somewhat important. Although this is heavily divided, perhaps not surprisingly, between those who say they're going to vote for Biden, for whom 68% say that it's very important, and those who say that they're going to vote for President Trump, where only about 11% say that it is very important. And this is reflective of the two candidates' methods of dealing with climate change. President Trump, of course, famously tweeted that he thought climate change was a hoax that was developed by China. Since then, he's become a little bit softer on that. In the most recent presidential debate, he actually bragged that the United States amount of CO2 has declined during his presidency. Although it should be noted about that claim that while true, most experts say that that's driven primarily by how much cheaper things like natural gas and alternative energies have become, as opposed to any particular policy pursued by the administration. One of the early acts in his administration was to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. The argument was that he wanted to renegotiate the agreement, although thus far there hasn't really been any perceivable action towards that renegotiation. And according to a Columbia University review, the president has essentially overturned or substantially weakened about 160 environmental regulations, including regulations dealing with fuel standards, methane emissions, drilling and mining on public land, as well as even things like light bulbs and rules that have been passed by Congress about what kinds of light bulbs were for sale in the United States. Now, we haven't seen the impact necessarily of a lot of these rollbacks yet. That's partially because most of these rollbacks are currently being disputed in the courts. Various states and local entities have sued the government in order to prevent the rollbacks from coming into place. But one of the things that we are likely to see if the president is reelected is that you'll begin to see a lot of these kind of rollbacks begin to take hold only in terms of the second term. The president has also suggested that he would be quite aggressive in preventing states from taking their own independent actions on climate change. For example, stopping California from its goal of reaching all electric vehicles sold in the state by 2035. Former Vice President Biden has been explicit in saying that he accepts the science on climate change, and he's actually called it an existential threat. Suggesting that he considers it one of the main threats to humanity in the future. He has set a goal of getting to net zero carbon emissions and energy by 2035 and net zero for all sectors, including transportation, by 2050. To do this, he's proposed a number of day one initiatives, which include things like reversing Trump's rollback of fuel efficiency standards and methane standards, and moving the federal government towards greater fuel efficiency in electric vehicles. However, for the larger legislative agenda, he's actually suggested a number of items which, while some are bipartisan, some of them would also require Democrats to have majorities in the House and the Senate. But the summary of these packages, because I can see that my time is getting close to expiring here, is that he's proposed about $1.5 to $2 trillion of federal spending over the course of the project to do things like make heavy investments in research and development, electric vehicles and transportation, improving sustainable housing and fuel efficiency in housing, and also climate capture. One of the key things to understand about net zero emissions is that you're not talking about eliminating all fossil fuels. What you're talking about is a combination of use of alternatives as well as trying to capture carbon or pull it out of the atmosphere. And so, as I see that I've already gone over my time, I'm going to go ahead and
I'll give
stop
you the
there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Next, we'll have Johanna Luttrell from the Hobby School discuss issues around racial justice.
Yeah, so thank you for having me, and happy to be here. So I'll just talk about Black Lives Matter here, and it's playing an interesting but maybe like invisible role in the election currently. And so there's good indication that Black Lives Matter is currently the biggest social movement in US history. That the protests this summer were the biggest protests in US history together, and much bigger than, I'll make a couple of comparisons here. The civil rights movement, which was relatively small, but had a huge impact. So the civil rights movement, we're just talking in the hundreds, thousands, not millions, but had a huge impact on law for years. The Black Lives Matter movement, we're talking in the millions. I'll get more into that later. And so there's a lot of comparison happening between Black Lives Matter and civil rights. Black Lives Matter is much bigger. It's huge. So that's interesting. The second largest movement, social movement in the United States that a lot of people don't know about or don't calculate into their thinking about social movements is the anti-nuclear movement of the late 80s and early 90s. And this was a movement that brought together a large cross-section of society where it was multiple religions, different classes, cross-section in terms of race, and wherever people came together under one common cause, which was anti-nuclearization, pro-peace. Interesting. And then but the Black Lives Matter is bigger than that. And then Black Lives Matter is bigger than another precedent, maybe the Women's March, which is more recent history, which was a huge single day event, well coordinated. Black Lives Matter is more diffuse than that, and doesn't have a sort of centralized coordination in the way that the Women's March did. So in July 3rd of this summer, the New York Times reported that somewhere between 15 and 26 million people participated in Black Lives Matter protests this summer following the death of George Floyd. And a couple other interesting things happened this summer, in that Black Lives Matter protests moved out of being only in the major cities or mostly in the major cities, and they moved into rural areas. So you had all these protests in rural towns that you didn't see before. And that is a huge shift, I think, in terms of the landscape. And then more white people protested than ever before. I was surprised personally to see my 14-year-old nephew in small town Iowa posting about protesting in Black Lives Matter, new thing. And so now you have cross sections of society protesting in ways that hadn't been before. And then we see the spillover into now things like the NBA and these large, Black Lives Matter having this voice on these large national platforms in ways that we hadn't seen before. There's an interesting way, though, that I think social movements get forgotten in the national narrative of an election. So here we are a couple of weeks out from the election, and we had this huge movement this summer. And then BLM is not being taken into the polls and the explanation of voters' primary worries in ways that it might have been this summer. But that doesn't mean that it's still not on people's minds. It's just not coming into the narrative, the national media narrative. And the impact, I would say the impact of social media is underrepresented in public policy textbooks and in political theories as well. But the issue is that people's experience is not forgotten. So people who went out and protested, maybe for the first time this summer, they remember that. And then given that so many people came and supported Black Lives Matter this summer, their lived experience of what that was like, I think will probably shape their votes in a way that's maybe not being articulated right now in a national narrative.
Okay, thanks very much. Next, we'll move on to Professor Pablo Pinto of the Hobby School and talk a bit about the implications of the election on economic and trade policy, broadly construed.
I'm going to start, it's like on the other dimensions, how the economic conditions, the current economic conditions may affect how people vote. And again, this is an important topic because Trump ran on a platform which was based on his expertise as a business person to turn the economy around. And his credentials on that got upended in March when COVID-19 brought the economy to a standstill. And the recovery from that, has not fully happened. And so that put a dent on that record. We can talk later on about how strong that record was and whether Trump, who's good at selling himself, might have oversold his contributions to economic activity. But we cannot talk. So if people vote, as many people consider, based on a retrospective and pocketbook approach to what the government has done for them lately, that is not great news for Trump. And so you can see him trying to talk about the fast recovery post COVID-19 that, in many instances, has not fully happened. He was hoping for a V-shaped recovery that's not happened throughout, in particular because we have not controlled COVID-19, and that has had an impact on how individuals deal with their economic consumption and work patterns. In the expectation that they might get the disease. So these are two conditions that are very important to understand how they might impact one of the biggest, elements on which Trump wanted to run this campaign. So it's really hard to think about that, without looking at the impact of COVID-19. Most analysts suggest that for small and medium-sized businesses, the conditions are way below, somewhere between 10-15% below what they were in January. And that has repercussions, on job creation, consumption, and the like. So those are very important conditions coming into the economy. Now, looking forward, the other element that he wanted to run on is on his accomplishments on trade. And so Trump was quite successful at campaigning in the Midwest on a platform that was mostly aimed at revisiting all the trade agreements that the US had signed with the rest of the world, starting with NAFTA, but also following with, I mean, it's like the Pacific Rim area, and we have the famous TPP that's almost forgotten now. That was one important element in that campaign. And the main reason there why Trump became competitive in that election is because he was an unusual candidate from the Republican Party. I mean, the Republican Party tended to be in the last 5 decades the party of free trade, and Trump ran on a campaign of protectionism, which resonated in the Rust Belt. But again, there was something that had to make this credible for a Republican candidate to be, I mean, it's like jumping over a Democratic candidate on the trade issue. And that was, I mean, it's like the race issue that Johanna was talking early on. So the idea that Trump was able to become a credible candidate on the trade dimension because he could pull some voters away from the Democratic Party on the race dimension. I mean, it's like on these threat that the white blue-collar workers felt. And it's like not only from competition from China, but also, I mean, it's like from losing privilege within the American economy. And that played nicely in areas that the candidates had to, I mean, it's like win in order to win the Electoral College. And the reason why many of those white blue-collar workers decide to sit out that election or vote for, I mean, it's like the Republican candidate is because the Democrats, I mean, it's like had pretty much given up on that part of the electorate. And it's like, so you could see in 2008 when Obama was campaigning in the Midwest, talking about the perils of trade and trade with China on the Rust Belt, that he, I mean, it's like sent his economic advisor to Canada to tell us like, this is just pandering. I mean, it's like when I win the election, we are gonna sit back and keep the relationship as it was before. So these are important elements that show why, I mean, it's like trade played an important role in the past. It might not have played today because despite the many years of these administration, I mean, it's like not delivering on the trade policy might have pushed some voters back to the Democratic Party. This is as much as I want to say now. I mean, I don't want to bite into other people's time, but we can continue this conversation later.
Okay, thanks very much, Pablo. Now we'll move on to Elizabeth Simas, and we'll talk about court appointments and the Senate races.
All right, thank you. So the Supreme Court is looking to add another member unless something really drastic happens. It does look like the Barrett confirmation is going to go forward, and that will leave our Supreme Court with a 6-3 conservative balance. There's some really key policies that have been talked about a lot in the discussions around Barrett's possible confirmation and what this is going to do for the future with the court. In particular, two that come to mind that have really been discussed a lot. One is being healthcare. The court is scheduled, I think, in mid-November to hear some really key cases on Obamacare. They possibly could just completely gut it. There may be more piecemeal action that happens, but obviously this has a lot of potential ramifications, especially in light of COVID. As we're seeing unemployment go up, we're seeing more people without employer-sponsored healthcare needing to be on that marketplace, possibly needing temporary Medicaid and these types of programs. What this is going to do for their ability to get health insurance, it raises some questions. Another major question that comes up really tied to COVID is if Obamacare goes away, will insurance companies have the ability to make decisions or offer differential policies and rates based on pre-existing conditions? This is something that has come up, and it raises some questions now. Does a positive COVID test, even without any other underlying symptoms or need for treatment, is that going to constitute a pre-existing condition, and will that put you in a different category for health insurance? Republicans have said that no matter what happens with the courts, that, or what happens, if we get rid of, they've said that if they get rid of Obamacare, they're going to take care of pre-existing conditions. We haven't seen a full policy for that. So these are all concerns that are, as we look forward to what the court is going to be considering over the next couple months, that's a very immediate concern. There's also some policy concerns when it comes to abortion. Obviously, with the 6-3 majority, and people have looked a lot at the cases that Barrett has decided in her lower court levels and what this is going to do for abortion. There was a recent case in the court dealing with the Louisiana heartbeat measures, and the court actually, said no, that's not okay. But in doing so, Justice Roberts, in some experts' view, laid out a roadmap for those that want to go forward and push back against Roe versus Wade. His decision was very clear about why that particular measure was not okay and how these future lawmakers and future law writers may be able to craft legislation that would be more acceptable to the court. So that's another potential issue that we could see the court taking up. Now, Supreme Court justices are elected for lifetime appointments. We don't vote on them. So what does this have to do with elections? It actually has to do a lot. So even though our Supreme Court justices are not elected and they're supposed to be very insulated from politics and partisan politics, the truth of the matter is they're not completely insulated. They themselves have viewpoints. They have partisan viewpoints. The court has an interest in having their decisions be considered legitimate and having their decisions being upheld at the lower levels. They can make a decision, but it's still upon bureaucrats and legislators and state levels to really implement these policies. And so the court has a vested interest in moving policy in a way that is also going to be acceptable to people, that's not going to lead to increasing challenges, that's not going to possibly, inspire Congress to try to pass a constitutional amendment to overturn the court in and of itself. So I would say that Justice Roberts in particular, as the head of the court, is going to be watching these electoral results. If there is a very large Democratic swing, in particular, if we see Biden win and we see the Democrats gain a number of Senate seats, even take back control of the Senate, this is possibly going to be taken into consideration for the court. The court has they get to pick which cases they hear. So one thing that Justice Roberts has done in the past is that he has been very selective in choosing which cases he takes on to his court. And so really divisive cases may just be avoided or punted back to the state level. There's been a tendency of this court to do that so far, to try to push things back to the state. And so, I think there's going to be influences on just what the court does. They're going to be watching the results of this election in order to preserve the legitimacy of the court. The other way that courts and elections are tied together is that although we don't nominate or vote for our justices, we vote for the senators that confirm them. And I have some research with my UH colleague, Alex Batis, where we looked back at people's opinions of the recent Gorsuch and Kavanaugh appointments. And we found a relationship between people's agreement with the way their senators voted and whether or not they voted for their senators in 2018. So it does appear that voters will hold senators accountable for this behavior. And certainly our senators act as though they do. So if you've been paying attention, there's a hot Senate race up in Maine, Susan Collins. She's already come out and said, no, she's not going to support Trump's nominee. She didn't do it on ideological grounds. She said it was just a matter of the procedure, that she felt that the next president should have this nomination. So, that was unarguably a very strategic move for her, looking out for her own electoral interests. A few other key Republicans who are fighting tough battles right now, Bennett in Colorado, no, not Bennett. Who's the other one? The Colorado name escaping me right now, but there's a tough race in Colorado. Arizona, Martha McSally is fighting for survival in Arizona. They both said, no, we're going to support the nominee. Same with Joni Ernst in Iowa. So it looks like, again, that this nomination is going to go through, but this could have repercussions then with Republican control of the Senate, as right now the Republicans are holding a relatively slim lead. And so this may shift things in the Senate if people are really not happy with the fact that this has gone through so close to the election, and with the Republicans doing this after they blocked Obama's nominee, in 2016. So these things do have a lot of affect our elections, and our court decisions really are one related. And also, the Senate going forward is going to be looking at public opinion on all these things. And so if there is a possibility that the court is going to be passing down rulings on healthcare and on abortion, we may see legislation coming through the Senate. In particular, I would not be surprised if, somehow they're going to have to address in law this idea of pre-existing conditions. I think there's also a lot of talk about prescription drug prices that I think that we're going to have a Congress that's going to have to take up some of these healthcare issues, especially in light of COVID, regardless of what the court is doing. And so I'll sort of leave it there. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, Beth. Now we'll move on to Dean Watson and transition from looking at the United States big picture and zeroing in on implications of the election for Texas.
I'll do that. It's Cory Gardner in Colorado, and the latest polls have him down about Hickenlooper at about 50%, and Gardner is in the 40% range. So that'll be an interesting race to watch. Hickenlooper, of course, the former governor of Colorado and former candidate for president on the Democratic side. So I'm going to come at it slightly different and talk at least first about what this race, this presidential race, the impact it could have on the Texas legislature in the upcoming elections, because I think that makes a big difference, Biden or Trump, and what happens with either one of those people in office. The first is that this is the most competitive presidential race in Texas in a very long time. And depending upon what polls you look at, I saw some numbers today that while Trump won in 2016 by about 9 points, there's some polling out there that shows that he's ahead by only about 1.5 points. An average has him, one that I saw recently, has it at around 4%. An average of polls has it around 4%. That is a close race in Texas on the presidential level. And that means that has implications down ballot and what that might look like in the Texas legislature, particularly since in the Texas House of Representatives, if the Democrats were to pick up 9 seats, they would have the majority in the Texas House of Representatives. It is not going to happen that in the Texas Senate that you're going to switch majority, although there is some speculation that at least 1 seat will go back to the Democrats in the Senate seat that runs from San Antonio. It's currently held by Senator Pete Flores and runs from San Antonio pretty much all the way out to El Paso. It's a huge West Texas district. But if you have a Republican Senate and a Democratic House, that will make a big difference in the way legislation moves. There's going to be a new Speaker of the House no matter what, because Speaker Bonin has indicated that he is going to leave. Well, more than indicated, he will not be there in January. So regardless of which party wins, probably the next speaker is going to need to have some votes from the other side. It's going to create a real effort at least some level of bipartisanship in the House, even if the Democrats don't get all of those votes, all those 9 votes needed to get the speakership. Now, where does that make a difference? You've heard several people talking about on this panel, talking about different specific aspects and the influence that the different president would have on what happens in Texas is pretty significant. For example, if we talk about things like climate, we talk about things like healthcare and the Affordable Care Act, and I'll come back to a couple of other things. But when you start talking about those sorts of things, the ability of a president to influence how a state reacts to those kinds of things, everything from, as Professor Kennedy has talked about, the money that would be spent on different things to incentivize activity, and how the Texas legislature, particularly as it faces a very difficult budget session, how it would react becomes very important. A key factor is the Affordable Care Act, of course, because Texas is one of the few states that has not engaged in an expansion of Medicaid. I think we're now down to only 12 states that haven't done that. A number of states have done it by referendum, including very conservative states. but Texas has not done that. In my opinion, it's ridiculous that Texas hasn't done that. But the question then becomes, what happens if there's this continued push and you end up having the Affordable Care Act go away? What do we do, as the professor has talked about, what do you do about pre-existing condition, and what is a pre-existing condition? She was talking about it in the context of maybe even the Supreme Court, but at the state level, what happens at the state level in a split Texas legislature if the Affordable Care Act goes away? But perhaps even more fundamentally, it is the state of Texas, through our Attorney General, that has pushed the court case that would do away with the Affordable Care Act. Two things about that. One is, depending upon who's president, you will have a different Justice Department, and that Justice Department can very much influence the course of that litigation. The second is that it may be that he faces real difficulty in the legislature in terms of his budget if you have a change in the Texas legislature. I'll also mention, since I'm talking about the Justice Department, Dr. Luttrell was talking about the role that civil rights is playing right now. You know, in Texas, the courts we've had a real split over and over and over again when it comes to things like civil rights and voting rights. There have been challenges to actions taken by the Texas legislature on things such as voting rights, where the district courts have ruled against the state of Texas, only to have the Fifth Circuit, again today on voting rights, it's my understanding the new ruling has come down, but that makes it more difficult to vote. You've had the court step in. It will make a difference, I believe, if you have a Justice Department that is also intervening in that litigation and being helpful to those that are making challenges to Texas laws on things like voting rights and abortion rights. That's another area where it would make a difference to have a Biden Justice Department as opposed to a Trump Justice Department challenging some of the actions of Texas state government. Not to mention the fact that having a different person appointing different judges will make a difference in how those judges are ruling. Redistricting, I'll just mention just briefly, and we can talk about it some more, but the complicated way we go about redistricting and some of the changes have been made in part by the Supreme Court on the Voting Rights Act has diluted to some degree what the Justice Department can do on the front end. But again, having a Justice Department that is attuned to civil rights and redistricting being done in a way that does protect voting rights will make a real difference. And I'll pause there for the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. So at this point, we're open to the other attendees if you guys have any questions based on what the 5 panelists have said. If you want to collect your thoughts for a moment, I'll be checking the chat on the side. But while we do that, I think I'd like to go back to Professor Kennedy and talk about something of concern to Texas voters in particular, but where would these 2 candidates focus starting in January in terms of US energy policy going forward? So I mean, from the outset, there's an obvious notion that Biden is going to be more amenable to something like the Obama Green Jobs Initiative, and that Trump has his pro-coal initiative. But what does that look like? And to what extent can either person coming into office have a major effect on the direction of energy policy in the next 4 years?
Sure. Energy policy is actually an area where, at least in recent presidencies, we've seen the executive have quite a bit of leeway in terms of what they can do. And although I will say that what oftentimes happens is that effect of any particular president's action is usually delayed by a few years, because whenever a president tries to put in a new regulation or has the EPA change the way that it enforces certain rules, You then have a system where usually they are going to get sued by the state attorney generals from the states that are of the opposite party, and it's going to get caught up in a rather lengthy court battle before it actually gets implemented. But in terms of the energy focus, the two candidates have really drawn, quite large distinctions between themselves, between each other. In particular, aside from just the, the coal initiative versus the green jobs initiative, both of which you're right. Those are two areas where they dramatically disagree, and there would be differences. There are other things as well. So for example, former Vice President Biden has suggested that he would not allow for new fracking on public lands. Now, I should note that that's a lot more limited than what President Trump claimed that Biden supported in the debate. He claimed that Biden was going to stop all fracking, which is not the policy that's been proposed. Conversely, President Trump has suggested opening public lands substantially to greater use by the fossil fuel industry. This includes, for example, national wildlife refuges in Alaska, a number of areas of new offshore drilling. Basically what we see is an entirely different philosophy. One philosophy suggests that in order to protect jobs, we need to, really expand access and reduce regulation on fossil fuels. The other one says that the way that you create jobs and improve the environment is by trying to create new jobs in alternative energies and renewable energies and carbon capture. And it really is a very distinct choice here between the two candidates, which is not always the case. More often on environmental issues, Republicans and Democrats are a little bit closer together. In this case, you really see a big distinction in terms of where their emphasis is.
Okay, thanks very much, Ryan. I'll continue to take this opportunity to pick your guys' brain. So Johanna, you talked a bit about the novelty of the BLM movement in terms of the numbers of the members. It's obviously more of a virtual movement than previous social movements have been. Also, its membership is more diverse. So as we transition into the next administration, regardless of who wins, how do you see the BLM social movement transition into a legislative agenda, if at all? How will it constrain policy issues related to social justice and perhaps police reform or something else?
Yeah, I mean, it could go both ways here, depending on who wins, because in addition to it being, there being so many new protesters and having a greater degree of support for a movement, there's also a greater degree of pushback too, because it is so visible, both on social media and on national media. And so, depending on who wins, I think the pushback to proposals coming from the movement, like even on the local level, like, bail bonds, and on the national level too, like a national police reform agenda, there could be a lot of pushback to that too, as well. And so I think it's an issue around BLM. They've done some polling, and I say a lot of people are talking about it in their homes now, and with their children, but it depends how, not everybody's talking about it in the same way. And so sometimes depending on who's talking, they say, oh, well, this movement, this is not something that we support, and so we're against it. And so there's a lot of talk on all sides, but it sort of depends on who is the voting. But I think it will be on the agenda, but we'll just see how in various ways.
Thanks very much. So moving to Professor Pinto, both candidates are talking a lot about, right now the economy doesn't look so good because of this unprecedented pandemic, but on day one, just you wait, I'm going to turn things around. So what are the differences that we can expect from a Biden versus Trump administration come January in how they deal with this? I know that one of the big Democratic talking points has been the V versus K-shaped recovery. Do the Democrats have meaningful solutions to do better than Trump on this recovery?
So this relates to the issue that Professor Kennedy was raising about environmental attitudes towards environmental regulation and the future of energy. The approach that Republican administrations have taken has usually been lower taxes and deregulate economic activity in the hope that that would spur, it's like the expansion mostly of small and medium-sized businesses that would lead to higher employment and full allocation of resources. The problem that we face now, as we can see with the stalled talks on rescue packages to help the economy bottom out from the recession generated by the restrictions imposed after COVID, is that we need, it's like many people are staying home out of concerns of the contagion of COVID-19, and the consumption habits have changed, and people have lost their jobs, and people are not able to pay their loans or their on their homes or their rentals. That issue requires some stimulus from the government that hasn't been fully forthcoming, and that is also reflected in the attitudes in Congress, especially in the Senate, in terms of whether or not to release a new tranche of relief resources for economic activity. So you can see the big difference there is that you can expect a Biden administration, and he has already put out a plan for that, to increase spending, government spending, especially procurement, in what he calls, made in America goods and services. And that's going to be an important component. He's talking about $400 billion in infrastructure and other forms of spending that would spur production of American-made goods. And that's an important condition. You can expect, on the other hand, on the side of Trump, more deregulation and more pressure, it's like on keeping interest rates and monetary policy being the driver of the recovery at a very low level. It's like, but again, it's like this, what we call the V shape versus the K shape, it's like a recovery, have different implications for, it's like different economic agents in our economy. So we can see now, for instance, that less skilled workers, working in services that have been impacted negatively by COVID-19, like some forms of retail, restaurants, and other forms of services, some types of manufacturing and the like, are not going to be recovering fast. Now, keeping interest rates low, it's like, and having no options with your money and savings to go, those are likely to go to financial markets and it's like on stock markets, and that would keep pushing a rally in those financial assets. So you can see a very different scenario on those two. Now, the reluctance to embark in a large or a larger scale intervention in economic activity to help boost the economy, well, most of the analysis of the recovery and how long it would take, looking that we were not going to be back to early 2020 until probably the second quarter of 2022, may require, it's like hitting the economy with some forms of support like we haven't seen since 2008. And I don't see, a Republican controlled Senate, for instance, be willing to engage in that type of activity.
Okay, thanks very much. So I have a question from an audience member, and this is sort of an open question that I think many of you will want to jump in on, and feel free to take it in any direction you'd like. But it's, how would a Biden administration relate to the progressive constituency of the Democratic Party? will he swing left on anything or stay centrist? Seems there's some implicit skepticism about that in the answer. So who would like to jump in there?
Go first if it would help. So I think from what Biden has promised, that we will see some movements left. And I think that's certainly a start. I mean, whether it will be enough for the most progressive wing of the party, but he's got to start somewhere, right? And he will, I believe, start moving left. He's already said that he will pass, certain executive orders, or he'll make certain movements. Again, he might not be going as far as the Green New Deal, but he's promising something. So we will see movement. I think one of the biggest things to watch if Biden wins are his cabinet picks. And there's been some discussion and petition to him about who he's going to put in his cabinet. But I think that will send a very telling signal about the direction in which he's going to take policy. There's a lot of speculation about, Elizabeth Warren, for example. She could serve in several different roles, or, there's talks that maybe she could become the Senate majority. There's a lot of talk. But, if he were to put her in a key position to where she could really move policy in a very progressive direction, I think that would do a lot to satisfy a lot of the more progressive wing of the party, and it would, certainly take policy in that direction.
I'll just add to that. First of all, I agree that what you're going to see, I think you're going to see him attempt to do two things at the same time. One is he is going to be the healer in chief, and we can never lose sight of the fact that that's going to be one of his top priorities, is to try, he has been very clear about this, and he is going to try very hard to govern in a way that allows for a healing of this country, and to try to salve the divisions that we've been dealing with. And as a result of that, he will not be, in my view, as out front on specific issues where it is seen as checking a box to satisfy the hard left or the more progressive wing of the party. That is going to be a key part of his presidency. That leads to the second part, which is exactly what the professor is saying, and that is, I think the way you'll see him do some of the more progressive things. I mean, keep in mind, this is somebody who has talked about, for example, unions in a way that we haven't heard in a long time. He is talking about climate in a completely different way, maybe not Green New Deal, but beyond what we've seen. But one of the ways he will do that is he will continue to play his role as healer in chief, and there will be others like cabinet members that will make a difference.
I have a two-finger on this. It relates to trade. I don't see Biden pivoting back into a more free trading stance, like you have seen the Democrats in the past. He might go back to some multilateral arrangements. And trying to do this in more like bilateral way, especially when dealing with China. But I don't see him with a soft stance on China when it comes to the tariff, because it has important domestic politics repercussions here. So you can see this push for Buy America, and pushing China back, not only on market access. It was one of the dimensions why we were imposing tariffs, in the hope that China would force China to open up its market to US goods as well, and being able to export. But the other two relevant dimensions in that relationship are with respect to industrial espionage, which is an important dimension that most administrations are likely to deal with, and hopefully they can do it at the multilateral level. And the second one is intellectual property rights protection. Remember that the US economy now is a net exporter of services, and those services require stronger protection of property rights, intellectual property rights. And so you can imagine and foresee a Biden administration pushing in that dimension. The second one that I think is also very important on the local level, and that's related to this issue of empowering unions and workers, is a push for raising the minimum wage. raising the minimum wage. That's another important issue where you can see, it's like Biden, it's like catering to the more progressive side of the party who believe that a $15 minimum wage is the bare minimum that you should tolerate at the federal level.
On issues related to Black Lives Matter and Biden, I can see potentially, I hate making predictions, but I can see potentially in the future that a Biden administration would be more active in terms of issues about police violence and issues about mass incarceration than even an Obama administration was. But I wouldn't want to give the credit in advance of this potentially happening to a Biden administration when I think that's it's an issue of the times in which we live, and the agency too of these hardworking activists across the country that have pushed that to where we are now. And so I could see there being shifts in a Biden administration, but I also wouldn't want to say that's a shift to the left or the right necessarily, because I think now that there's such broad support for issues around police violence and mass incarceration that we don't necessarily have to talk about it as a shift to the so-called left, and to talk about it like that sort of undermines also the agency and the power and the hard work that these activists have done as well.
I actually have a follow-up question for Johanna on that. So, if you're saying that you don't think it would be the credit of the Biden administration, so do you think we will see change going forward, even if we have another 4 years of Trump? Do you think these activists that this movement is that powerful?
That's a good question. I do, because I think that we've seen change in the 4 years under Trump so far. And, even in Harris County, we had this shift on bail bonds, and then the shift in around jails, and then the shift in what the activists in Harris County are doing a lot of stuff. And one thing that they're doing now is working under COVID outbreaks in jails and trying to help that. And then also doing mutual aid work around COVID relief packages too, and eviction stuff. And so you see, just here, you see so much change just from the Black Lives Matter here locally, that I think that change can happen too. It happens on a local level too, under Trump administration as well. So I think
but that would be on a local level.
That is, but those changes are meaningful to people, so
I'm not questioning that. We were just talking about at the national level. I mean,
yeah, maybe not at the national level.
Yeah, and at the state level, you've got Greg Abbott threatening to take over the city of Austin because of things that it's done related to policing. So I think I agree that you'll see change. You'll see continued change where you have progressive leadership willing to make that change, like locally in Harris County and what you've seen there. But I shudder to think of another 4 years of Trump pushing back the way he does, and actually coming out in favor of white supremacy groups.
Yes. So yeah, for sure. There's the pushback, and then we've seen the resurgence of white supremacy and open white supremacy in the last 4 years, and so that's on the national level and local level in places as well.
Professor Kennedy, I'm going to pull you into this. You spoke a little bit about Paris Accords and the difference in the environmental policies between the two candidates. If Biden wins, how much of an impact can he make toward addressing those progressive policy goals, right?
Okay, so two parts to this. So relating this back to the original question about whether or not he's still going to remain tacked to the center, or if he's going to try tacking more liberal once elected. The environmental policy is really interesting. First of all, what he's proposing is clearly not the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal is a lot more ambitious than what Biden is proposing. with that said, the proposals that have been laid forward are actually some of the more ambitious policy proposals to try to counteract climate change that we've seen from a presidential, from a major party nominee in quite a while, right? It may not have gone as far as some of his competitors in the Democratic primary, but it still is, a pretty ambitious policy that he's laid out. Now, in terms of what actually can happen, this is going to depend a lot on down ballot races. It's going to depend a lot on who controls the House of Representatives and who controls the Senate come the end of November. There's, for some things, like I said, he can do right off the bat, but for a lot of things, especially to get that amount of spending that he wants for these policies, he's going to have to go through Congress. And so it's going to depend a lot on that. There's also a third aspect to it, which is the state level prospect. Simply by not opposing states who are trying to take greater action. We forget California has a GDP, it's by itself 10th largest in the world, something like that. California, Texas, a lot of these states are, the size of many countries in terms of economic activity. And so, simply not, standing in the way of states like California, Washington, Oregon, New York taking greater climate action will have an independent impact regardless of what regardless of what Biden is able to do through the legislature. Just had a flashback there to Sarah Palin for you all with that Biden moment.
Okay, thanks very much. So we're going to go to a question about the Barrett confirmation, but sort of one that gets at some things that Beth was saying. If Biden wins and Barrett is confirmed, what are the chances for court packing? What would a packed court look like? And can a court be packed with a simple Senate majority?
Oh gosh. I don't know, right? So this has been the question. Biden has said in the past that he's not a big fan of this, but court packing can look like a lot of things. Some people say that what the Republicans have been doing in blocking Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland, that in itself was court packing, in that he kept the court at 8 versus going up to 9. I quite frankly, at the end of the day, and in my COVID outbreak, not that I have it, but and that cannot recall the exact procedure of what it would take to pack the court. I wouldn't take it off the table, however. I don't know really what's going to happen, but like I said, even if Biden wins, I don't know that the court will be so bold as to come out right away with these very striking things like just, getting rid of Roe v. Wade right away. I think the court will be more particular and more strategic in the way it handles things. And then the response, I think the response is going to depend upon a lot of how exactly the numbers shake out with the election, and also how that transition goes, how civil the transition is, and how much that's going to really activate the fight in the Democrats, and the way they're going to approach this as, okay, we're going to have to fight this all the way, or does it look like we may be able to get our way without going to such things?
Does anyone else want to jump in on the prospect for court packing?
So yeah, my impression is similar to Professor Simas's, that Biden doesn't seem to be a big fan of it, but I think he's hesitant to actually say that out loud, just because there's a fear that as soon as he does say out loud that he doesn't want court packing, it gives his senatorial allies less leverage to try to stop the Comey Barrett nomination.
Okay, so this question transitions back to Trump's protectionist economic policy, and asks you, I guess, implicitly, if President Trump wins a second term, what will his economic policy, his recovery policy, look like, and how will it impact COVID? So what will he do, I guess, in addition to what he has done to turn things around? And this could go toward Professor Pinto or anyone else who'd like to jump in.
So in terms of protectionist policies, we've seen that they have had a negative impact on our ability to get procurement on PPE, right? It's for first responders, and it's like and the medical sector and the like, precisely because some of those elements that were needed, and it's like protective equipment, were coming from China. And this is an issue that we have done research on at the Harvard School. We released a report in April, right before, and it's like we had the results from the pandemic, looking at how the trade wars with China had a very negative economic impact on the national economy, but also on the regional economy. And one of the main reasons why they have this impact is that those policies were conceived with a mercantilist approach to policy, where exports are good and imports are bad. But the fact that we don't figure it first, I mean, it's like by entering into these tariff wars, China retaliated, and they retaliated surgically in order to create some cost, political cost on Trump based on where those tariffs were imposed. The tariff on, for instance, soybean exports were really hurtful. And it's like in the prairies, in the plain areas of the northern part of the countries in the Midwest, and that's not was not good for. I mean, it's like Trump's re-election bid, and that's why he had to provide subsidies to agriculture producers to give them support. But going back to this idea of exports are good and imports are bad, in the integrated economy that we live in today, lots of imports are imports of inputs that we use for producing goods and services. So by imposing extra cost on the inputs that we import, we are making firms that sell in the local market but also export less competitive. And so consumers ultimately wind up paying, I mean, it's like a higher cost for those goods and services. And that was an issue that was observed. For instance, the tariff on steel resulted in, and also related to the tariff on household appliances, led to a high increase in the consumer price index in that sector that we are doling out as consumers. So you can think about that, those types of policies which are aimed at expanding economic activity are not gonna be great. I mean, it's like for the US, as we try to jumpstart our economy post the COVID-19 inflicted recession. So that's not optimal. I mean, it's like, and again, I mean, it's like, that doesn't mean that that the outlook will be very different. I mean, it's like with a Biden administration, because the tariff wars have to be, I mean, settled in some way. And it's not gonna look great for Biden just to walk away from that negotiation right away.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have a question here, which gets at something that I think all of us political nerds have been worried about, which is every day, if you go and you look at the poll of polls and the 538 predictions, you know, I keep having the day after scenarios in my head of, you know, 2016, oh, well, you idiots don't understand that 20% doesn't mean impossible. So have pollsters learned anything from 2016? Can we treat polls that we're seeing today as more accurate than they were in 2016? If so, what adjustments have they made?
I'll take a first stab at that. Yeah, so because I put myself both in the category, I guess, of political nerd and of someone that worries about that. So I'll just admit it right up front. And so some of my reading on that, trying to and by the way, I run with political nerds, you know, birds of a feather. So they're always asking me about what I think about the polling. You know, what some would suggest, and very good pollsters would suggest, is that 2016 really wasn't that bad. Everybody saw the numbers, they saw national numbers, and so that everybody was convinced that it was over. But then what happened is Trump outperformed, but not by a ton, not by huge percentages, but in a few key states that made the difference in electoral votes. He outperformed by it's what some would suggest, probably in the margins even there, but that outperformance is what got him the electoral votes and made him president. If you look at what happened in 2018, 2016 to 2018, and now 2020, 2018, I think folks would argue that there was adjustments made from having said what I just said about maybe it wasn't as bad in 2016 as we thought. There were adjustments made, and they were made in 2018. And so you saw arguably better results in 2018. And some of those adjustments, and I'm not going to know all of them, but some of them is doing a better job of weighting education and the role that education in the electorate was actually playing in how people would vote, and therefore how that needed to be weighted. Another big weight difference that I've read about or know about is the difference between urban, suburban, and rural, and how you weight those as well. So I must admit, I continue to hold my breath every time I see these polls, and Steve Kornacki can cause me to go, go into the ether with all of the numbers that he runs at you. But I do feel like it's better. I also think they're doing a better job of paying attention to some of the crosstabs that you get on. Well, not just the crosstabs on who's doing it, but on drilling down on issues like likability and things of that nature to help them make the determination on where things might come out.
And if I can add to that, I agree. I think pollsters are doing a better, they're doing a better job with the weighting. I think pollsters' discussion of acknowledging that these things have a margin of error has been better. For example, I believe if you go to the New York Times, the Upshot, they show, here's our models and our forecasting on this year. Here's what it would look like if we were as off as we were in 2016, and here's how it would look if we were as off as we were in 2012. So I think there is this greater conversation about the fact that these are probabilistic estimates, not a, hey, this is what's going to happen. I also see a much greater focus on state level versus national level polls, because that's, again, something that threw people off a lot in 2016 is that, it's not the national vote it's not even any vote that determines the presidency, electoral college, right? So, we really do have to look at certain key states. However, I'm not sure the media has learned the lesson. And that's, to me, what is alarming, because the media is the one who is reporting these polls to individuals. And when the media just runs with the top line and doesn't look under the hood as to, well, did they survey likely voters or all individuals, because that makes a big difference. There's a lot of nuance that often gets lost in this type of horse race journalism. And so I think that can be misleading to the average consumer who's just scrolling quickly through a news feed and sees, just the headline and doesn't read all the way. And one last thing that I think is interesting / my skepticism in polls is that a lot of these polls, like I said, they look at likely voters. One of the best ways they determine whether you're a likely voter is if you voted in the past. We're looking at unprecedented levels of turnout. So that's inevitably going to probably throw off some of our estimates. And I said that was my last thing, but one more thing too that I'm always skeptical of polls is they always tend to show these undecideds. And our academic research suggests that at this point, people really aren't making up their mind between Trump and Biden. I mean, there's such huge contrast between these two individuals that, what's really going on with those individuals? Are they simply not going to vote? Or are they, there's some concern that they're the hidden Trump voter that is not wanting to admit that they're a Trump voter, although there's limited evidence that that's actually a great deal of the population. But that also gives me pause when I look at polls sometimes, when I see too many of what I think are too many undecideds, because our academic research suggests that that's not that large of a group.
So I'm going to have to leave here in order to do daycare pickup real quick, but just going to add one other thing. So, I mean, basically, all the points that have been made so far are dead on. But I'd like to add one more other kind of note of caution, which is that polls are trying to estimate what the election or what the vote is going to be. but voting itself is a noisy measure of what people actually want to happen, right? There was a convincing case made after the 2000 election in Florida, the 2000 election, which was decided by Florida, that one of the problems in Florida was that you really had such a close vote that if we were thinking about this probabilistically, it was probably in the margin of error of voting, right? That if you count a few ballots one way, if a few people, if the weather changes in a particular area, that the voting ends up turning out differently. And what's interesting about this election is that we have more of, I think, that potential noise in the signal than we would have in a normal election. To put it away, that one campaign strategist put, we have more known unknowns in this election than we've possibly had in any other election in recent memory. Between mail-in ballots and how they're going to be handled, between the court challenges that are inevitably going to end up happening, between who's going to show up when, how many people are going to be driven away by COVID, how many people are going to end up leaving the lines because the lines end up being too long in particular areas, how successful are the efforts by certain states to try to discourage people from voting going to be. We've got a ton of unknowns that we have going into this. So while the polls are trying to estimate what's going to happen in the election, and we talk a lot about the uncertainty, in the polls, that's really dealing with sampling uncertainty, right? Sampling and turnout uncertainty. It's not dealing with this kind of uncertainty of whether courts will allow naked ballots in Pennsylvania, right? Naked ballots are the ballots that are turned in using regular envelopes rather than official envelopes. And that's a whole nother area of uncertainty that we have, especially if things, as some are expecting, begin tightening up towards the last part of the election. One other last thing is that one of the big things in 2016 was that there was a shift in the final, right up before the election. This is when James Comey made the announcement that they were looking into Hillary's emails again. And one of the problems was then particular states like Wisconsin and Michigan, where they thought that Hillary was pretty locked in. There wasn't a lot of repolling that was done after that announcement took place. And so we can't rule out that there would be something like a last minute surprise. But I think polling groups have gotten better about making sure they've got some money stashed aside to do some last minute polls in case something like that does happen. So thank you all for having me. I'm going to have to go pick up one now.
Thanks,
Let
Ryan.
me piggyback on the latest note by Ryan. So the issue here is that we have data that comes from polls, right? Those are data points. The main issue that comes next is what do we do with that data? We're trying to predict how individuals are going to behave and whether or not they're going to vote. And we have models for those, right? So the errors can come from different sources. One is, it's like the bias in responses, right? It's like, right, which is a possibility, which goes above and beyond the margin of error of a poll, which is a function of the numbers, right? It's like, and whether or not the poll is, it's like the sample frame for the poll is well designed. But the second part is like, given the data that we have to make predictions where somebody's going to show up in the polls, right? And that's the idea of the likely voter. And we tend to use the same data to make those predictions, right? Because we're collecting data about those individuals, whether it's like, and they might be overestimating, it's like their likelihood of having voted in the past or who they voted for and so on and so forth. And so we build on models of past turnout, it's like to try to predict current turnout. It's like, and those sometimes can be off. It's like a good friend, Hector De Leon, at the Harris County Voting Authority has shown, it's like, for instance, the estimate of registration rates by different groups, it's like, in terms of age and ethnicity in the Harris County area, for instance, and he shows a big difference in terms of the Hispanic voters and the lower age voters registering at a higher rate that you have predicted in past elections, right? That doesn't guarantee that they're going to vote, that it makes it more likely that they will vote because now they are registered. So those conditions affect, how we predict the likelihood of voting, right? And it's something that pollsters don't tell to share with the rest of the public, right? That's the special sauce that they use to predict and make, and weight who they expect to be winning. So there are a lot of uncertainties, as Ryan talked about before. There are issues that whether it rains or it doesn't rain, and that's why people tend to vote early, try to prevent some happenstance events from keeping them from getting into the polls. Enthusiasm might play a big role. or even efforts to keep people from voting might impact, our predictions and the divergence from what we get from pollsters and what we see in the poll of the polls, which is November 3rd.
I have to say, the way I am a political nerd is that every night before I go to bed, I check how many people in Harris County have early voted. It's making me so happy these days, and I just want to keep that happiness alive here.
Well, okay. So with that, we're running to the end of our allotted time. I'd like to ask the panelists if you guys have any final words. The overall theme of the panel was supposed to be, what are the implications of a Biden versus Trump win? And I think we've stuck to that. This is the second in a series of such roundtables. And so at the end of the foreign policy one, I think we ended up kind of having a conversation about the effects that Trump has had, and then sort of shrugging or sighing about the prospect of Biden actually having much capacity to change course or adjust course. And I guess I'm wondering, on the domestic issues you guys are interested in, those on the left, particularly those nerds looking at, last thing at night, first thing in the morning, thinking that next year is going to be a Biden presidency, will that matter? To what extent can we expect a major correction from the seismic shift that has been the Trump administration?
Well, I'll start by just saying the difference in these two is so substantial that it is almost without question that you will see a significant difference. And if things continue on the path they appear to be going on, and there is the kind of change in the United States Senate that might occur, then there's no question it will be a very significant shift.
Anyone else want to jump in on that last bit?
I think my sense is like a lesson learned from the beginning of the Obama administration, when Obama went slower than he might otherwise, and tried to get across the board buy-in to the policies. I don't think that that would necessarily happen if there was a big change in Democratic control. I think that, who knows, but I think that Biden, it would be quicker, a Biden administration, than it was in the Obama administration, because Obama was trying to make friends. And I don't think that Biden would do that to the same degree.
And I'll agree with her, and I would add that, and he has far more experience in the United States Senate being a deal maker and figuring out how to move things.
Professor Simas, Pinto, any last words on this matter?
I side with Dean Watson and Professor Luttrell on these issues. I think the composition of Congress is going to be fundamental for the ability to push the agenda. In some areas, it's going to be easier than others. It's like, so we talked about environmental issues, though those will take longer. Recovery has to be a strong priority. That's probably going to be healthcare. It's like, particularly since the pandemic is nowhere near gone. We haven't turned the corner yet, unfortunately. And even if we have a vaccine, it will take a while until things are back to normal. Access to healthcare is going to be an important issue, and one that needs a fast resolution. That resolution can only come, with a different composition of Congress.
Yeah, I agree with everything. I think one of the differences, though, if we're thinking about this contrast between domestic policy and foreign policy, is there's so many different actors that can affect domestic policy. And while I do think there's potential for big change, particularly if there is a shift in the Senate balance as well, we will see, I think, some tension in our federalist system of states and federal government. And that's where the tension is going to lie, is states trying to put forward policies that maybe are in contrast to those that the federal government would prefer. And we'll see the legal challenges coming out of that. So, I think there will be movement, but it also may highlight some of the differences, again, between these different levels of government.
Thank you all for these really thoughtful answers, and for the participants and the attendees who have taken out of their day to talk about all of this. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much.